Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you a look at the image quality from the new Sigma 45mm F2.8, and this is a DG, which means it's for full frame, but it's also DN, which means that it is for mirrorless. And so this is actually a Sony FE full frame mirrorless that I'm looking at. There's a Leica version as well, but I'll be doing this review on a Sony A7R Mark III, so a 42 megapixel sensor. So, in my first look, which I recommend that you take a look at if you haven't already, we took a look at the build and the design, and there is really nothing but good to come out of that. This is a feature-rich lens that is a little bit of a departure in terms of its design and its look, and it's got I would say that the most similar look that I could ascribe to this, it actually kind of reminds me of some of the cine versions of the little Samyang lenses, in that it's got, it's got a focus ring that is ribbed, but it kind of stands out, and it's also got an aperture ring that stands out in a similar way. It almost looks like it's designed to be geared in a little bit. And so kind of a classic look, but a lot of good things, a lot of metal in the construction, and so really, really nice, and also extremely compact. Now, as we go on today, however, and take a look at the image quality, I actually, and by the way, I'm actually filming on a second copy of this lens right now for the simple reason that I had Sigma send me a second copy, and so I could verify the results that I was getting. Because it's a somewhat un-Sigma type lens in terms of its performance profile, and so I wanted to make sure that I was getting accurate results before I reported back to you. And so I'll explain a little bit more in my summation at the end of the looking at the images themselves. But first of all, let's jump in and let's take a look at what we find when we break down the image quality from the 45mm f2.8. So the first thing that we can see is that the image on the right is actually what you will typically see on import into your favorite software, because the Sigma does come with embedded profiles, and so even in the raw file, it will automatically select the appropriate profile. I had to manually deselect that profile to give us the image on the right, or the left, I should say, that gives us a little bit more look at some of the imperfections here. And so what you can see is that there definitely is some pincushion distortion, which you can see curving down there. You can also see some vignette along the edges. This is the image that you're going to see upon correction, and you can see that you do lose a little bit of the image. If we look here on the left, you can see that you're losing a millimeter or two of width here along the edge in the correction process. Now this is an advantage over the Samyang AF 45mm f1.8 because it doesn't arrive into Lightroom in the raw form with any kind of embedded profile. In fact, there really isn't a profile yet that I have found. Now what you can see on the right, it's actually the same image. This is the JPEG version. And so you can see that the JPEG does receive some correction. You can see that the vignette has been corrected somewhat. And also, in this case, there's actually not pincushion. There's a little bit of barrel distortion, and you can see that that's been corrected there. But the raw file is not going to receive correction. That being said, there's not a whole lot there that requires correction. So if we compare those two JPEG images, now we have the JPEG out of camera from the Sigma and the Samyang on the right, what we're going to find is, first of all, looking at the center, you can see that even at f1.8 versus f2.8, that the Samyang has considerably more resolution and contrast. There's kind of a bit of a haze over the textures, a veiling that reduces contrast, whereas the Samyang looks nice and strong. If we move towards the edge of the frame, we find that it is similarly true there, that the Samyang is definitely sharper at f1.8 than what the Sigma is at f2.8 in the center. Now, if we stop the Samyang down to f2.8, obviously the difference becomes even more marked. And you can see that there is tremendously more sharpness and contrast on the Samyang in the center of the frame, and moving off towards the edge of the frame, we can see that the same is true there. It's not as marked a difference in the corners, but there's definitely a strong difference in contrast in the edges of the frame. If we look up here towards this corner, we can see that the Samyang's a little bit softer up in this corner. And finally, let's look down in the lower left, and here the Samyang has an edge once again. Now, fortunately, the Samyang takes a big leap forward at f4 compared to f2.8. Now we're back to looking at a raw file here. You can see that it's night and day from f2.8 to f4. That's good news for sure. And if we look down into the corner of the frame, even the corners are sharpening up here at f4. On down to f5.6, we see that the corners are nice and crisp now, and so that we have good solid resolution and contrast across the frame. If we check back in with the Samyang, we find that it too is impressively sharp in the center of the frame. I can't really call a winner between those two. There might be the mildest edge for the Samyang, but without seeing them side by side, I don't think you would see a difference. And looking in terms of the edge performance, it's pretty much similar. Again, maybe the slightest edge for Samyang, but nothing significant, you know, for all intents and purposes. They are roughly equal in the corners now. Now, minimum aperture is f22, and so looking center of the frame on both these lenses, we see that diffraction has softened both of them up somewhat. Samyang has survived a little bit better at f22, and looking off into the corners, you know, there's not a whole lot of difference in the corners. Neither looks great at f22. Now, because I was a little unsure of the results that I was getting from the Sigma at f2.8, I actually had Sigma send me a second copy, and so I could compare the two. And so, however, what I found is that the results were not remarkably different between the two. And so you can see left copy and right copy. The right maybe looks a little bit sharper, and looking off into the corner, you know, maybe the slightest bit, but that's just pretty much typical copies, you know, variation. It does look a little bit better here on the right. And so anyway, that just gives you an idea. There is a little bit of sample variation, but for the most part, they are more similar than different. So after doing some research to try to figure out what's going on here, I discovered that even the lens designers attest to the fact that the lens is not particularly sharp up close. And so if we look at the image here on the left, you can see that here near minimum focus distance, it really is quite soft, very low contrast, and that it's kind of optimized for the bokeh rendering and not so much for sharpness. So we've got same shutter speed, same aperture. Now, if we look over here on the right side, and this is at, you know, a distance of more like 10 to 12 feet, we can see that we've got a much sharper looking result here. And so it's a unique lens. It doesn't have any floating elements, and so byproduct is that it, although it can focus down quite closely, it's actually not very sharp up close, and you need to be out a little ways before it sharpens up. We'll explore that a little bit more here. And so shooting now indoors in easily controlled lighting for consistency's sake. So what we're going to find is, first of all, the tripod is set up at the same distance, and both of these lenses are basically the same length. And so what you're seeing here is that, at least at close focus distances, there is a variance in the actual focal length. And we're going to find that that's true also compared to a zoom set near 45 millimeters. And so byproduct is that either there's some focus breathing taking place with the Sigma, or it's a little bit shy of the actual stated focal length. But again, looking at, with both lenses wide open here compared to the Samyang, you can see that number one, the Samyang definitely closes in, you know, much closer, and we're going to see that Samyang is closer to the actual focal length when compared to the zoom lens. But you can see there's a huge difference in the amount of contrast and clarity of the Samyang, even though it's at f1.8. So if you're going to shoot up close, you really need to stop the lens down, because again, there's a massive difference between f2.8 and f4. So this is Sigma on both sides, and you can see that the f4 result is night and day. And so if you're looking for priority of sharpness, you need to go f4. Now, the downside, of course, to this approach is that the stated priority in the lens design is smooth bokeh rendering. So if you stop it down, obviously you lose some of the creaminess of the bokeh, and so it you know, there's more contrast that enters into the autofocus area, and it's just not as soft and creamy. And so it is a little bit of an optical challenge here, because you lose some of the benefit of the lens when you stop it down to gain another benefit. So with both lenses stopped down to f4 here, We can see that the Sigma is every bit as sharp as what the Samyang is, and arguably even a hair sharper. However, looking at the defocus region, I think you would be hard-pressed to say that the Sigma is any softer than what the Samyang is on the right. So I've got the popular Tamron 28 to 75mm f2.8 zoom lens because I wanted to see how it compared. So note that it's set at 44mm. It's set on the exact same tripod, and as you can see, it frames much tighter than what the Sigma does. And so again, you know, that variance in focal length and or focus breathing. We can also see at f2.8 that the Tamron kind of blows the Sigma away in terms of the resolution and contrast there up close focus performance. Now looking at the autofocus area, I do think that the the Sigma is a little bit softer in this area here when you compare the two, and so it does live up to its, you know, its purpose at wide open apertures. So with both lenses at f4, you know, they're both pretty much equally sharp. You know, the Tamron is obviously really good for a zoom lens, and so it's super sharp here. Looking at the defocused area, again, you know, once this lens is stopped down so much, it kind of loses some of that advantage in terms of the softness of the bokeh, and so, you know, it's kind of a catch-22. So if we move things out a little bit, this is now at a 6-foot focus difference, so, you know, right under 2 meters. Now we can see that once you start to get away from that close focus area, sharpness definitely picks up. And so now what we have got is pretty much parity between the two in terms of the sharpness. And so here is where the Sigma does have some advantage, because you can definitely see that the bokeh here does look softer and less busy than what it does on the Tamron. And so that's really the true advantage, is not at minimum focus for close focus work. The advantage here is more when you're shooting at, you know, medium to further distances, because you get the advantage of the softer bokeh rendering, but you also get some sharpness on your subject. Now, if we compare the Samyang here and take a look at how it performs, Samyang actually looks a little bit better here at f2.8, and so it's a little bit crisper, a little bit better contrast here. However, let's look at the bokeh rendering, and it's not as busy as what the zoom lens was, but I still think that the Sigma delivers the softer performance there in the autofocus region. Looking at this here, it's less of an advantage for Sigma here. This is, you know, at a little bit different focus distance, is a little bit softer maybe on the Samyang. One other thing to note is that the framing is now pretty close to being equal, and so maybe it is a little bit more of a case of focus breathing when it comes to the up close focus performance. So let's take a look at one more example here with the difference between the contrast and resolution and then the bokeh. And so you can see here at f2.8, as we've come to expect at close focus distances, there's no doubt which has the better contrast and resolution. Looking at the defocused area, I would say I think the Sigma is a little bit smoother looking. However, it's not vastly different than that of the Samyang. And here's the other thing to consider. With the Samyang, you have the option of opening the aperture up to f1.8. And so as you can see, now the Samyang, I would argue, has the, you know, softer blur in the background. And even at f1.8, it does retain a, you know, an advantage in sharpness and contrast over that of the Sigma. So here's a look at two copies, the two different copies of the Sigma 45mm. And so looking at a close focus result here, not a whole lot of difference. They both handle it pretty much the same. Looking at the defocused area here, it also looks about the same. And so performance being fairly consistent between these two copies. Now, if we throw the Samyang into the mix, you can see the Samyang, you know, has a little bit more contrast here on our subjects here. And then looking at the defocused area, definitely this circle is a little bit smoother and less busy than what the Samyang is. And so, you know, that's the selling point for the Sigma. So there's definitely right and wrong ways to use this lens, or I should say at the very least, it depends on, this lens is for certain people with certain priorities. And so I like to shoot a lot of this kind of shot, you know, at a fairly close focus distance to throw out a background. That's kind of the advantage to shooting with a prime to me. And so it's not great for this kind of shot because it isn't particularly sharp. And so it does have nice bokeh rendering, but if you prioritize having both sharpness and then also nice bokeh, it doesn't quite give you that mix. However, if your shooting style shoots a little bit further out, you can see here that we've got really nice looking resolution and contrast at f2.8 along with a nice, bokeh background. You're not going to get as much background blur, but maybe you like, shooting images that look a little bit more like this and you shoot from, medium to further out distance. It might be a good choice for you there. If you stop the lens down to landscape type apertures, there's no worries. It's got lots of resolution, contrast looks fine. It's not record breaking, but it's going to deliver really good looking images, no problem there. Here's another example here. Colors look good to me, contrast looks good, and you can see in the plane of focus, very, very crisp delineation of details. Everything is holding up quite well. Finally, let's look at a couple of portrait type shots, and so you can see here, shooting at portrait distances, there's enough detail there. The background is, nicely defocused. It doesn't have anything near what we just saw with the Otis in the same kind of setting, but at the same time, it delivers good looking results. One last result, this is actually at f4, and so you can see if we look at the subject, we've got a nice detail there. Not mind-blowing detail, but if your priority is good looking skin tones and you don't need as much resolution as what some lenses provide, then everything looks good there. The fall off looks good on the image, color rendition, everything looks pretty solid here. So as you can see, this lens certainly has a very unique design philosophy and a very unique profile. And so if you're looking at an f2.8 prime lens and looking at it primarily from the perspective of being able to get a sharper result than what you can with a zoom, as we saw when we compared it to the Tamron 28 to 75mm f2.8, that's simply not the case. I don't think that there's any way to split it to say that this is the sharper lens of the two. It's not. Where the advantage comes in, of course, is that this is a lens that is optimized more for the bokeh rendering. In fact, it's kind of the polar opposite of my typical look at a Sigma type lens. Sigma lenses, for the most part, are optimized towards very high, sharpness, resolution profiles at wide apertures. And, if there's anything that's left out, sometimes it feels like the rendering is kind of the afterthought. It's like the opposite in this case. It's skewed all the way towards the other perspective, that at wide apertures, this lens is not particularly sharp, and it's more prioritized for producing soft bokeh rendering. In fact, in many ways, I'm most reminded out of, I've reviewed lots of lenses, many dozens of lenses over the years. And so the lens I'm actually most reminded of is when I reviewed the classic Zeiss planar 50mm f1.4, in that lens is not particularly sharp wide open. It gets sharp when stopped down, much like this lens, but its priority more is a really nice soft bokeh rendering. And so in many ways, this lens has more of a classic lens, and even not just Zeiss classic, but I'm talking about classic in terms of film era lenses, and that it's kind of optimized in the same sort of ways. So at the end of the day, of course, this is not going to be a lens for everyone. If your priority is, you're buying a prime lens to be able to get really, really crisp results at wide apertures, or particularly if you like to get close to subjects and throw backgrounds out, as I explained that I like to do, this is not a lens for you. However, if your shooting priorities are a little bit different, it might work just fine for you. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to what kind of shooter you are and what your shooting priorities, what you value in images. And so, of course, it is a little bit complicated when you consider that the Samyang runs a couple $100 cheaper, and no matter how you slice it, it is the sharper lens of the two. So stay tuned for my final episode where I'll wrap everything up, and we'll take a look at a few other things as a part of that. I'll give you a little bit more look at some images not shown here. We'll also take a look at video performance, we'll take a look at autofocus performance, and you know, kind of wrap everything up and maybe give you a little bit more recommendation about who the lens is for and who it is not for. In the meantime, however, you can look at the description down below. Take a look at the image gallery that's linked there. I find often looking at images from a lens kind of gives you a sense of whether or not you like the rendering from it, and so that's certainly worth doing. You also have options there to purchase one if you would like to get one for yourself, and of course there are the typical links to follow me on social media, to become a patron and get advanced screenings of upcoming content before anybody else. Also, you can sign up for my newsletter and make sure you stay up on all the action. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.